beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You're there once in your life.
What kind of a peace do we seek? Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died some 38 minutes ago.
Here is the suspect, 24-year-old Lee H. Oswald.
I'm just a patsy. President.
Who actually fired the shots that killed Kennedy? Was there a conspiracy?
In the years since the Warren Report, there is now so much more that we know. Conspiracy theories are now conspiracy facts.
The Warren Commission successfully deceived the public.
Allen Dulles' appointment to the Warren Commission is one of the great frauds of American history.
Documents are withheld by the FBI, the CIA.
Intelligence agencies did all the wrong things if they were looking for conspiracy.
We will go back and piece together new facts and evidence that shed more light on what really happened here that day.
The Commission believes that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit Connally. Well, I don't believe it.
It is indeed a magic bullet.
Oswald was a figure of interest for 4 years before the assassination. They were reading his mother's mail.
His first year in office, Kennedy made many enemies.
He vows he's going to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces.
Have you ever committed any act of violence?
He was intimately involved in the cover-up.
Once you kill a president on the streets of American City, that sends a signal.
The rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened.
If America really wants a democratic society, and we should get to the bottom of this traumatic crime that continues to reverberate throughout American history.
This nation will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. That was the very dramatic trailer for Oliver Stone's documentary presenting basically, at least what I think anyway, it's a slam dunk case that U.S. President John F. Kennedy's assassination was not done by Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, as the Warren Commission said. In fact, it was likely not done by Lee Harvey Oswald at all. The story that the government wants us to buy and has wanted us to buy for decades. It's a story that the mainstream media also has not paid very much attention to. And if you think about it, that is remarkable, right? This is maybe the biggest story, maybe in American history, not sure, but it feels even bigger than 9/11 in a sense. And the reverberations as a result of it will last longer. It is a tear in the fabric of America, especially given that it seems that the belief that the Warren Commission report was wrong, that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the shooter, that dark forces, many of them on the government's payroll, were involved in the killing of this popular young president. That's a widely held view if you ask Americans what they think. They know that they've been deceived, and yet there doesn't seem to be, beyond a few really gifted researchers, many of whom work for Oliver Stone on this new film, which is called JFK Revisited, Through the Looking Glass. Not very many people are still talking about it. It's really a strange, strange thing. And Oliver Stone believes, and the people he worked with believe, and there are very many smart people, serious people who believe that until this crime is actually publicly solved, and the people who did it are named, even though they're probably all dead, that this will fester and is festering today. And I believe that's true. So we are lucky to have Oliver Stone on the program today to talk about this film. Just to remind you, if you don't already know who he is, well, of course you know who he is, but know how accomplished he is. He is known for Platoon. He's a director and a screenwriter too. Platoon, Wall Street, Born on the 4th of July, The Doors, JFK, Natural Born Killers, Nixon. And he is also known for work that, in my view, is equally important, but maybe a little bit less well known and certainly less cheered on by the mainstream. And that is his documentary on Ukraine called Ukraine on Fire, which was pulled, of course, from YouTube when big tech and the media decided what the acceptable Ukraine-Russia legacy could be. It can't be anything but what they think it is. But they've put it back up with a warning on it, which they always do on anything that challenges the mainstream narrative. I have some of my videos with little warnings on them too about COVID-19 information. So I know what it feels like. But anyway, it's back up. He moved it to Rumble, and I think it's still there, but it's back on YouTube again, thank goodness. And he also did some interviews with Vladimir Putin at a time when Putin was the subject, let's just say, of some American misinformation and disinformation, meaning the false story started by Hillary Clinton and her campaign that Donald Trump was a Russian puppet and that Russia had hacked the election. None of that is true. And he was courageous enough to interview Vladimir Putin while all of that was going on and was criticized. Of course, he was called a Putin apologist and all the rest of it, right? So he's a brave guy, and he's doing the work that legacy media should be doing and isn't doing. So what a great time to have him on, especially given the last 2 years that we've had. So we did this interview weeks ago, and I've been promoting it for weeks, but we held it because, especially here in Canada with the truckers and then the Emergencies Act and the looting of bank accounts by the government, we had to cover that as well. And I wanted to hold this until there was a moment where people could really think about how it ties into what's happening today, this documentary. So for those of you who are not clear on the story, I don't know if there's anybody out there who isn't, but I'm going to give you the Coles Notes version that in November of 1963, a very popular American president, John F. Kennedy, was violently, dramatically, on a sunny day in Dallas, Texas, in an open car, murdered. His head was destroyed. It would come apart all over the pink Chanel suit of his lovely young wife, Jackie Kennedy, as she was known then. And it was a suit she wore for the rest of the day. As a woman, I found that tribute to her husband very, very moving. She refused to change, and when asked about it, she said ominously, "Let them see what they've done. Let them see what they've done." So we are going to explore with Oliver Stone the documentary, which is now available on iTunes and I believe Amazon as well. He finally got a distribution deal. You will hear us talking about his inability to get one earlier, but he has one now, and he's quite happy with it. He got a good deal, so that's wonderful to know. We also talk about Ukraine a bit, and again, this was recorded before the Russian invasion, and he wrote a further comment on Ukraine and Russia, which I will read to you. This is post-invasion, which I will read to you after the interview runs, just so you fully understand Oliver Stone's position on that. We want to be fair. But here's why this is important. What he is hypothesizing in the film is that Kennedy was killed by dark forces, some of them on the payroll of the U.S. government, because his foreign policy positions and other ideas about what he was going to do moving forward were not accepted by the dark forces that in the government who believe that they are the ones who should be running things. And that includes the CIA. So what Oliver Stone says about why they wanted to kill Kennedy, he summarized in one of the documents that you get in the press kit for the documentary, and I'm going to read it to you. 2 years before his death, Kennedy had authorized the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, a plan originally put in motion by his predecessor, President Eisenhower, to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro. A year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis further stoked American-Cuban-Soviet tensions. Kennedy's careful diplomacy with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev ensured the Cold War did not escalate into an all-out nuclear Armageddon. In the same vein, Kennedy sought to withdraw the first of America's 15,000 advisors from Vietnam, and the month before he was killed, issued National Security Action Memorandum 263, withdrawing 1,000 of those advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1963. Much to the detriment of those seeking to profit from the escalating war in Southeast Asia. So that's the military-industrial complex he's talking about there. There's a wonderful clip in the documentary that I feel explains very well why understanding what happened to President Kennedy is important today. The person speaking is journalist David Talbot.
I think there's a direct thread between the events of 1963 and the kind of horror show that America is having to endure right now. And I think once you kill a president in broad daylight on the streets of American City, and everyone knows that powerful forces did it, that sends a signal, not only to the American people, but to the American media, to the American future leaders. And if America really wants a democratic society, and we should get to the bottom of this traumatic crime that continues to reverberate throughout American history.
So what he's saying is that if you can shoot a president, a popular president, in broad daylight and get away with it, in other words, there was a massive cover-up afterwards, and that the bad actors were on the payroll of the state, like the CIA, then the foundations of democracy are toppled. I mean, Talbot is totally correct, and I think we're seeing that today. Here is what Stone says about that idea. It's why he was so interested in following every thread in the Kennedy assassination. When you murder a U.S. president in broad daylight in front of the world, people sensed right away there were larger forces than one man at work, says Stone. It was a well-done, behind-the-scenes, staged execution all the way through its cover-up, from the CIA playbook on black ops, with all the bases covered and with plausible deniability for all. America was never the same after that, because beneath the surface, the intelligence agencies and the military took over the direction of the U.S. government on the big money issues, like national security and strategy. And since then, not one president has been able to change the course of that strategy. Every president has been limited in his ability to make significant changes in our militarized sectors. So that sure rings true, doesn't it? So here is the pitch for this week's show. It's the same as it is every week. Please consider supporting us through our Patreon or PayPal accounts, accessible through my website, trishwoodpodcast.com. Your generosity is much appreciated. Check our live stream coming on Monday at 11 a.m. with Joe Loria and Patrick Lawrence from Consortium News. We're going to be talking Ukraine again. That was a very popular show we did about a week or so ago. And you can check my pinned tweet at Wood Reporting for updates should the time change. I also have a YouTube channel now with midweek meltdowns, which are little videos of me updating ideas that can't wait for our Friday podcast drop. And we will be doing a live stream, Ask Me Anything, for our supporters at some time very, very soon. Also, our trucker merch is still up. We, the fringe beanies and baseball caps, I think we can all still wear them with pride and in solidarity with our trucker convoy protesters. And just so you know, we're on Getter and Instagram too. One has to spread oneself out in the age of censorship. We've been lucky so far. And so thanks for your support, everyone. I put the call out that if you want a shout out on the show, we're happy to do that. And I got a nice email from a woman named Lena Rosevier, and she's asked that I shout out her cousin, Tina Jensen, who is also a supporter and dedicated listener to the podcast. And she says, absolutely, you have kept her head in the game and have provided her with an outlet and resources and level of saneness. And she's truly grateful on her behalf. So thank you for that. We're happy to do it. So back to Oliver Stone. I'm not going to keep you waiting. I'm sure you want to dive in. And as I said, we will read his statement about Ukraine, because this interview was recorded before Russia invaded Ukraine. So we're going to be fair to Oliver Stone, read his comments made subsequent to that. So as you're listening to what he's saying in the interview, fully take on what a big deal this is. Number one, that he has virtually blown the cover-up out of the water. He, brick by brick, he makes the case, and it's hugely credible. It's well documented. The significance of it is absolutely clear and reverberates right through today. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the extra as well. But the bottom line is that dark forces in the American government got away with it. They got away with killing a president in broad daylight. So here is my interview with director Oliver Stone, recorded, I believe, on February 1st. So here is Oliver Stone. Hi, Oliver. How are you?
Hey, I'm fine, Miss Wood. How are you?
Trish, please. Are you in Los Angeles today?
I'm in Los Angeles, yeah.
Oh, okay. Lucky you. It's brutal here. So I want to start by asking you, I was reading some things about
where are you, by the way? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm in Toronto, Canada. So
I see.
It's snowy and pretty miserable here. And now it's going to be snowy for another 6 weeks or so. And yeah, not good. Yeah. I want to start by talking to you about how difficult it was for you to find a distributor for this project. And I'm just wondering, first tell me what happened and why you think it was so difficult.
JFK Revisited was actually the idea of the producer, Rob Wilson, who joined my office back in the 90s, and he was an assistant for me for a while. So it goes to show you if the assistants can develop into producers and directors and so forth. He loved it. JFK influenced him deeply when he was in Albany as a student, and he wanted to. He said to me repeatedly, "You've got to do something to. It's a legacy. You've got to establish the film. Otherwise, it may be forgotten." So he said, after 30 years would be the right time, and he stayed on my case. And it seemed like a good idea. Although obviously I didn't know it was going to be so tough to get done. Obviously, people had forgotten it and didn't want to remember it. Put it that way. So the money was not easy to raise to make it. Eventually, everybody in America turned it down. Every company. I can't go to every company, but I'm saying every distributor. And we got an English company to step in and put some money up for the film. And then we had another problem after 2 years or almost 2 years of working on it with Jim DiEugenio, who, by the way, was my inspiration. Jim had written several books on the assassination, and I would consider him one of the premier researchers into the case. He has been around for years. I've been consulting him. And I guess you'd say second or third generation. Yeah, I'd say second or third generation researcher. But he wrote the script. We did a 4-hour version of that script. It plays. It's coming out in this country in March.
Yeah.
But the 2-hour version, we couldn't sell that. We had no luck.
Yeah.
And then we cut it to 2 hours. We did a 2-hour version, and we sold that at Cannes, which, in other words, we didn't trust the American market. So we went to Cannes and we sold it to an English company, again, a distribution company, and they did a nice job. They sold like 10 countries or so. And eventually we came back from Cannes. That was in May of last year. We came back and we sold this thing to Showtime. Barely got it through. It was the only platform that would show it. We turned down again by pretty much everybody. So it was very disheartening in that sense. But and then when the film came out, as you may or may not realize, there was absolutely no major media.
I know.
Except dismissive articles here and there about, that it was a joke, but nobody dealt with the contents of the documentary.
Well, they don't anymore. They don't deal with actual contents when they're making arguments against things, right? They just kind of smear them and move on. It's a
They do. No one knows about it because they don't know the evidence. There are fools around like Gerald Posner, who wrote the book Case Closed in '92, but he doesn't deal with any of the new evidence. He doesn't deal with anything. I mean, Eugenio wrote a very good piece on him, I thought, excellent many years ago about his case. Case Closed, he called it. And that was, of course, supported extensively by the major media. Extensively. I can't tell you. Gerald Posner rose to fame attacking us. And then there was the Vincent Bugliosi piece, which was about, I think, 1,500 pages that Jim counterattacked. I think great articles. And Vincent Bugliosi was a very funny guy, but he was a prosecutor. You know that. He prosecuted Manson. Prosecutors are not really balanced people. They tend to they just look at the
they have an agenda. Well, the interesting thing about Bugliosi, do you know about this book about the Manson murders where the author actually
I know a little bit. I heard a little bit about it. Tell me.
Well, I actually forgotten the guy's name. I was trying to book him for the show, and I was thinking maybe even about doing a doc with him, even though virtually all the people in the book are dead now. But he found quite a bit of evidence that Bugliosi's case against Manson was actually pretty flimsy, and that there was a lot of monkey business going on around the case more generally. And it was quite interesting. It really, like for me growing up, the Bugliosi book was the true crime book, where there's In Cold Blood and then there's Helter Skelter, right? Those are the books that focus you on true crime. And he does a pretty good job of taking apart the case. I don't think he's saying Manson didn't do it, but of taking apart Bugliosi's case. If you don't know about this book, Oliver, you should. I'll send you a link because he was on Joe Rogan. This guy was on. Yeah. Do you know who he is?
Who are you talking about?
The guy who wrote the book about Bugliosi that was so devastating.
No, but I'm sure. No, I really don't. But I can't get stuck in all that stuff. You know, Jim DiEugenio would know about it, and I would go to a person like Jim. I am not. You have to realize, Trish, I am not a researcher. I don't have that kind of patience or time. It takes enormous amount to be a researcher. You have to read thousands and thousands of pages. They're sometimes the most boring material. And frankly, I don't have the ability or patience to do it. But I use researchers. And I think Jim is the best I've seen, at least who's living. There are others who are very good too. And obviously the people we interviewed in the film, from Gary Aguilar, Cyril Wecht, to everybody in that film, there's about 30 people we trust.
See, we're living in a strange time right now because I think about 10 years younger than you are, investigative journalist most of my adult life. And for me, the Kennedy assassination is the biggest story in the world. Maybe the moon landing was bigger, but I don't understand why people and the media and people have walked away, why they wouldn't be clamoring for what you've discovered, and why the Washington Post and the Times wouldn't be jumping on the new. I don't get it, Oliver. It's really distressing for me to see.
You don't get it? Really interesting. I think it's a mess. It's a mess for them because the major media went to sleep right away. It was amazing. That is where the real crime happened, the cover-up. And they never really expressed serious interest in going ahead. There was an uproar in the late 60s. Yes, there was. And the Garrison trial, unfortunately, backfired for a lot of the community because he didn't prove his case, but he had a weak case. He knew it. And of course, we mentioned that in the movie. He went after, by the time he went to trial after the grand jury, several of his witnesses had been killed or disappeared. And the CIA was on the case constantly. Had a file on Garrison. Several departments had files on him. They made sure that none of his subpoenas were answered. So out-of-state subpoenas. So as a prosecutor, he couldn't get there. But he did do some very valuable things. First of all, bring it to the public. He brought it into the public crosshairs. It was now official. And he got the Zapruder film to be shown in that courtroom, which was an amazing act of liberation from time life. And he also, of course, had Pierre Fink, one of the autopsy guys at Bethesda, testified to the extent that he said they were controlled. The military was controlling where they could touch and where they could probe. So that was quite a revelation. There were some other things in that case that are serious. And of course, since the Assassination Records Review, I assume you know what the Assassination Records Review Board is.
I do now, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that came as a result of my 91 film. They existed for several years. From 94 to 98, they were able to work and get out a lot of documentation, but not all. And among that documentation is the fact that Clay Shaw was a contract agent for the CIA, and we show the paper and everything. The guy was embedded with the CIA since World War II. So yeah. I mean, the fact is that Clay Shaw lied his way through the whole trial. He perjured himself, but whether he was more than a handler for Oswald, we'll never know. I don't think that he was involved at a high level. I think he was overseeing Oswald in New Orleans. That was really one of the things he was handling, but it wasn't like he was a major player here. However, the CIA guys who were handling Oswald, those are the guys you want to follow and track down, because that's the paperwork we want. Those are the files we want on people like Joanides, Phillips, among others. And also, I think I would love to get the files on their relationship with the Cuban communities, because there were a lot of Cuban activity in all these cities.
I want to get into some of this specific evidence in a minute, but I did want to ask you about a clip. I actually put it in my email to you because I found it very moving. And I think it's the reason we're here today. Someone in your film, right at the end, I think his name is Mr. Talbot says, I believe, he says, if you can shoot an American president in the head in broad daylight and get away with it, there's something fundamentally and egregiously wrong with where we are. And I was very moved by that because I feel like that resonates today too. And I also feel the American people, I think all people in Western democracies who loved President Kennedy and lived through that, I think most of us know on some kind of cellular level that it was a conspiracy. And until that's dealt with, there's a problem for us all in these democracies.
Sure.
Isn't that true? Don't you believe that, Oliver?
There's a huge gap in our history, and this is very bad for America. This is why it's important we face it. If we face what happened after World War II, we'll be a much healthier country. But we have all these people in government who are still hiding. Many of them are, I would say, really bad guys. And one of the reasons we become such a warlike state with massive surveillance is because we don't trust anything. We can't even look over our own shoulder without being scared. Part of this is a lack of trust that occurred on this shooting. The American people were not happy with the Warren Commission, which is frankly a farce. None of the, as we tried to show in our new film, not any of the original evidence holds up. That's the rifle, the bullet, the fingerprints, anything to do with Oswald and the testimony of the witnesses. None of it. It wasn't the way the Warren Commission, as Senator Schweiker said, was created to obscure the shooting and obscure the murder from the world. And they knew it at the time. Lyndon Johnson knew it. So did Jackie Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, de Gaulle, Khrushchev. And Castro. They all knew it was a right-wing deal. Robert Kennedy especially, and that comes to the essence of this issue. Why was he killed? Because that's been buried in history too. Why was Kennedy killed? Because of his record and what he was starting to do in the first term. That's why he was killed. And that's what we keep going back to. That's what I went back to in my 91 film. Why was he killed?
And let's talk about that, because unpack it a little bit, because the idea, as sort of put forward in your film, there's also a book about it that I just got from Amazon I'm going to read, about how Kennedy's march for peace is actually what imperiled him to not increase the troops in Vietnam.
Among other things, yeah.
Among other things, right, is actually what the evidence shows is what imperiled him, is it not?
Yeah, well, they made a big deal in attacking me back in 91 about Vietnam. But I had the evidence then because it existed in the National Security Action Memorandum 263. Fletcher Prouty was advising me in the film, and he knew a lot about what was going on in the White House as well as in CIA. He was an Air Force officer who was involved with both parties.
And that is a briefing note, just to be clear, that's a briefing note that suggests that Kennedy was going to do something, and then once he was assassinated, then Lyndon Johnson completely negated in that briefing document. Was it McGeorge Bundy or somebody who'd written the document, or
not just on Vietnam, Trish, all around the world, and everything except civil rights. Johnson changed everything that Kennedy was doing, and we go into on the 4-hour version. We go into extensive talk about Indonesia, about Africa above all, and Latin America. Everywhere he was starting to make these changes from 61 on. That was changed by Johnson. It's quite shocking, and I think that ties into one of the reasons why it's become a taboo subject, because we're raising the issue of what this president was in the conventional history of the United States. They tell you Kennedy was a brilliant speaker, all that, handsome man, but he was killed before he could do anything, and his policy was continued by Lyndon Johnson. And this is absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish. You have to read about Kennedy to understand what he was doing. And it's not just in Vietnam. The whole point was Cuba was the main issue of his life. I think that was the reason he was killed, not Vietnam. Because in Cuba, if you remember correctly, he failed to go into Cuba, to attack Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 in April. And then again, a second time, he failed to attack Cuba during the October missile crisis of 62. Those were 2 times he backed away from involvement, U.S. involvement, which would have been a serious, big deal. I mean, you understand, if we had gone into Cuba, reversed the revolution, or tried to, there would have been tremendous fallout in the Third World. Kennedy was very concerned with the Third World. He was an anti-colonialist to the core, maybe because he was Irish, right? An Irish person was the first country to find independence in the 20th century. Remember with their fight with Britain. So Kennedy, in his heart, was a revolutionary, but in that sense of supporting these regimes. Constantly in his writings, in his speeches, you find references to it. And as early as 1957, when he takes to the Senate floor as a senator, he was on the cover of Time magazine attacking the French position on Algeria, saying Algeria has to be independent. Earlier in 1954, in 1951, he'd been in Vietnam as a young senator, and he saw the situation with the French and repeatedly said the Dulles-Eisenhower policy on Vietnam will not work, they're going to go the way of the French, and that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened. He predicted it, but it's almost heartbreaking to see where we could have gone in 1964 if he'd been reelected, which I think he would have been. It would have been vast changes. Vietnam was a part of it. Yes, he didn't. He said, and this is a quote. He said, "If I'm not going to go to war, if I'm not going to go to war for Cuba, which is 90 miles away, why should I go to war in Vietnam? Send troops to Vietnam, which is 6,000 miles away." Yeah. This is logical. Vietnam was a losing cause. He understood that because he sent several delegations there, and of course his words about it. You see, he had to play a game. I mean, he had to play a game of getting reelected. In 1960, when he was elected, you could not be a Cold War. You could not be against the Cold War in America. You had to be a strong supporter of a strong America, because we've been fighting a Cold War. The propaganda in our country had been intense. since World War II, that Russia was the enemy and that we had to prepare for a nuclear attack and so forth and so on. So Kennedy had to adhere to that to get elected. But after he was elected, the first thing he found out when he went to Washington, he sent McNamara, he's the Secretary of Defense over the Defense Department, and he said, can you find out if we really have a missile gap? Because that would have been a big issue that he had supported, that we had a missile gap with Russia. That's to say the Russians were catching up to us and passing us with their missiles, which was nonsense. It turned out to be rubbish. We were way ahead of the Russians, way ahead, 10 times more missiles. We had a huge nuclear capacity in 1960. And that was the reason. And I'm going to go, this is the real heart of the matter. This was the reason why he had so many fights with the Defense Department and the CIA, because he didn't agree at all with their policy of the Dulles policy of not just containment of communism, but pushback on communism. Neutrality in Dulles' mind, I'm talking about the Secretary of State now, not the brother of Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA. Neutrality was a sin.
Yeah.
And he made it quite, and he said so in a speech. And it's a story of Kennedy saying, we cannot have a war. He said, he had been in war. He knew war in his guts. I mean, he'd been a PT boat commander, and you know the story. He saved several men's lives. He was truly horrified by war, and he knew its meaning. Whereas a lot of people who wanted the war, wave the flags, go to the parades, and then they're chicken hawks. They go into war, and after a few weeks, they want it to be over. They don't understand the price of war. And I raise this because this is a question now in our culture.
Is it ever? Yeah.
We see most recently, I turned on the TV the other day, watching CNN and watching both Fox and CNN just quickly because I can't stand them either. And It was unbelievable. There were young women on TV, correspondents now, talking in the most bloodthirsty terms about what we have to do to tough it out with the Russians. We have to be tougher and so forth and so on. Here are these young women, young men who have never been in any kind of war. They've even been in the service, and they're talking like fools. And then they cut to these generals. They have these generals in civilian clothes. You know about all this racket.
Oh, yeah.
Where they bring in all these experts who tell us how we counter the Russians in Ukraine.
And Max Boot, my personal
he's
nemesis.
Max Boot he's attacked us, but he's insane.
He is crazy. But it's true. Who
handled him the best was Stephen Cohen, your friend Stephen Cohen.
There's a clip. Let me just tell you this, Oliver. There's a clip of Max Boot attacking Stephen Cohen and calling him a Russian asset. And Stephen Cohen so brilliantly says, what? What did you just call me? Are you kidding? And he launches on him in the most kind of brilliant.
He says, I don't engage.
Like
ad hominem attacks.
Ad hominem. Stephen Cohen was my hero. I watched him throughout the Russiagate time going. I know his wife is the editor of The Nation, the most left-wing publication in the country. And here is Stephen Cohen going on Tucker Carlson, telling the unmitigated truth. I mean, this was a guy who was absolutely comfortable in his own moral universe. He understood very well that he had to say what he knew to be true, regardless of how many dinner parties he wasn't going to get invited to, in New York. And we were kind of email buddies a bit, and I was really sad when he died. The country, I think, lost a great hero when Stephen Cohen died. I don't even think they realize the hero that they lost. Because look where we are now. And no one's telling the truth, but, well, you are.
A very, very dangerous position. And we have a young generation of media reporters who seem to want war. They condemned Trump for not bombing Syria, and everybody, the media has become bloodthirsty, both right and left.
Yeah,
and scary to me. I mean, that's what leads to war when you have this kind of propaganda in the air. People believe them. They don't know the truth.
They don't know
the truth. They assume that we have an enemy. That's the American way of life. We have a threat inflation. Ever since I was born in 1946, I've lived under the threat of Russia in those years. And then since then, the terrorists, and now China, there's a long list of enemies that we have created and built up. And that includes Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, my God. I never understood why Trump had this thing with Iran. It was just so solvable. If we could only acknowledge that 1954, our involvement in the coup, 53 was a mistake, huge mistake. We've interfered with their democracy at that point. That was a key point. We keep doing that all over the world, interfering with democracy and putting our guys in. That doesn't work.
It never works out. It's always misbegotten, right? Every single one of them. And most of them are started on a lie. I was working at a show at CBC who, with the help of Harper's Magazine, when Harper's was actually doing journalism, exposed that the first Iraq War, the Gulf War as it was called, was started on the basis of a lie too.
He was a fraud too. They found that she was a daughter of an ambassador.
Yes.
to Iraq.
Yeah. So it's history keeps repeating itself. I don't know what's happened to my business. I don't understand it. And
well, you need to have an honest press corps, and we don't. That goes back to your original question. Why didn't they investigate this case?
Yeah.
Now, was the fix in before? Was the fix in before the murder? Don't know. But certainly the New York Times is suspicious because of their embrace of the Warren Commission on the day it came out.
Yeah,
no one ever in that group of reporters ever even bothered to wait for the 26 volumes that followed a few months later. Those 26 volumes are filled with errors. They went with the first report, which was 800 pages, and which is Dulles was on the commission and controlled pretty much all the CIA information that went into the Warren report, as well as the FBI information. And as we know, it came out years later, unfortunately, that there's nothing in that Warren report about the CIA's involvement in Cuba and trying to assassinate Castro. Nothing.
Well, let me ask you this, because we started talking a bit about the motivation here before we get into some of the more granular information that is exposed in your great documentary. But we talked about the idea that Kennedy was not, his foreign policy was not going to align with what the spooks and everybody else in DC wanted it to be. So given that scenario, do you actually say, and are you prepared to say which agencies you think were involved in the plot to kill the president? I know you don't name names, but what forces were at work? Who actually would have...
I can only tell you what I think. Everything would point to the CIA would be at the center of it, because Dulles had been fired by Kennedy with his two top people, but he never cleaned that house out. As you know, McCone was a figurehead, and Richard Helms became one of the chief guy running the place until he was appointed years later by Johnson. Richard Helms is dirty, and he was always. There's too many agents who had contact with the CIA groups throughout, in Texas and above all in Florida and Louisiana, and we know that they would be a huge amount of information. You'd have never gotten any good files from the CIA, not one. And all these years, not to the HSCA in '78, not to the assassin. The Records Review Board laughs when they told me the story about how the CIA guys would stonewall them. So that agency, it would look to me, would be also the Secret Service was stonewalled the Assassination Records Review Board because they wanted records of his trips to Tampa and Chicago in '63. Couldn't get them.
Wow.
Secret Service is weird the way they behave on that day, and since then. So aside from those two governments, and then I would look to the Cubans' connections, because they were very, very anti-Kennedy at this point. He had not gone into Cuba, which is what I said earlier. They were waiting for him to go in. Okay, they could forgive him once for Bay of Pigs, but by God, when the missile crisis happened, they expected him to go in.
Yeah.
He had a huge fight with the military at that point and he, thank God, Kennedy was a man who understood war. I'm telling you, we almost were at the point of war. It was only him and Khrushchev who stopped it, and with his brother Robert and the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin. They really worked at the top level to get information between these two men going. There was barely a hotline at that point. I think the hotline started to come in at that point, but you had to have people talk. it became clear when Robert Kennedy made it very clear to the Soviets that the hardliners in the that the Kennedys could not control the hardliners in the American government anymore. That was always an issue with Kennedy. He told de Gaulle, I'm not even sure I'm in charge of this whole government, which was always a problem for him because the CIA was operating off the shelf from the Eisenhower years, and the DOD, well, they were their own beast, but they put out Operation Northwoods. I mean, they wrote it all up, they planned it, which Kennedy heard about and canceled. Operation Northwoods was a plan to provoke a war against Cuba on American soil by causing a lot of disturbance and sabotage. And that would create a warm atmosphere enough, which is what they wanted to go into Cuba. So Kennedy stopped that. He stopped this. And he paid the price for it. People don't understand that. And they assume that, hey, we're here and because of what? Because of luck? I mean, we are at the edge of nuclear war. And
well, and we may be again, right?
No, yeah, but we have to understand how these things happen.
Let me ask you this, Oliver, because you alluded earlier to Bobby Kennedy having a sense that his brother's murder had been orchestrated by these kind of shady characters, and you had Bobby Kennedy Jr. on. I found that evidence really compelling.
Bobby Kennedy was riding on the CIA. His brother, after the Bay of Pigs, asked him to supervise and watch the CIA because they couldn't trust him. And he tried to do his job, but there was a lot of enemies against him. Helms hated him. they stonewalled him. They lied to him. The point is that there were several. Here's the thing that people don't understand: the Kennedys had to act against Cuba after the missile crisis. They did launch Operation Mongoose. Mongoose was an operation to sabotage Cuba, not to assassinate Castro. Not at all. No. In fact, well, I'll get into that later. But the truth is that Mongoose was a publicity stunt. It never was effective. He appointed Edward Lansdale to run it, and it was never really effective. And the CIA knew it, and they had their own plans, parallel plans to hope. Kennedy was hoping that Mongoose would be the sole reaction to Cuba. But no, the CIA kept going with its own parallel plans, working with gangsters, by the way, Roselli and Giancana, which Kennedy, when they heard about it, the Robert Kennedy was furious when he heard about it and cut it off. But they didn't really cut it off. That was the problem. CIA kept going with their plans of killing Kennedy right up to the day of his death with ZR rifle. So people don't understand that there's two currents at work here. One is Kennedy's trying to appease the people who say he's a communist and a treasonous communist traitor. A lot of people said that, and he appeased them, so to speak, by saying that, yes, we don't like the Cuba regime, but we're working on it with Mongoose, but nothing was going to happen. And eventually he was hoping that he had a back channel going with Castro on Cuba. Yes, with Lisa Howard and Atwood. So there's a whole interesting story about his Cuba, but Cuba it's not Vietnam. Cuba is the center of this story. And that is why they killed him. And they had the cooperation of Cuban groups and the cooperation of mob groups because they hated Robert Kennedy, especially from the mob years of the 50s when he was prosecuting them against them. What happened? I mean, it's a complex weave, but it's understandable. I just want to say one more thing. When the CIA Inspector General Johnson, when he became president, and Jack Anderson was a reporter back then, and he did a nice job, and stories started to emerge about this gangster connection, trying to assassinate Castro. Johnson said to the CIA guy, Helms, he said, give me a straight story. I want the IG, the Inspector General, to give me a report on what's going on with this crime, your alliance with crime and your attempts to kill Castro. And the IG came back, and in 1967, it was buried. The report was buried for many years. The report said clearly, and it's available now to read. The Assassination Records Review Board got it out, by the way. And the IG report said there is no evidence whatever that Kennedy knew anything about these assassination attempts. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So who's doing it? And
Who's
the IG is pointing, of course, to the agency itself.
Yeah. Wow. So I want to, it's also just chilling to hear you say that's why they killed him. That's an interesting thing to hear someone say.
What's interesting?
Well, it's just that to hear someone use those words, that's why they killed him. It shows how far this film has come. When I saw it, I thought, there's no doubt in my mind anymore that this was a conspiracy. It feels like a slam dunk for me.
But think about this in broader terms, Tricia. Since 1963, since that moment, as you said, his head blown off in public, it scared everybody. It was a signal.
It was so violent
that you don't screw. You don't screw with us. You don't. There's an element in American society, very anti-communist, very right-wing, and it's still here. And there's no way that you can make a deal, even now with the Russians, without exciting this huge hatred of Russia and China and Iran. Whatever you do, whenever you try to make a deal, you're going to be attacked from that sector. And it's still a problem in American life. Think about it this way, that since Kennedy was killed, not one American president that I can think of has been able to take on the military or the intelligence agencies.
Yeah. Well, I feel it's controversial for me to say it. I feel like Trump actually tried to do that, but I know it's controversial, but I feel like Trump actually tried to do that.
He tried at the beginning, but he was an idiot about it. He didn't go about it properly. And at the end, he backed down, and he was very servile to the military, and always praising them, always going out of his way to make. He did everything against Russia they asked him to do. Plus, he added the Iran freeze, which was horrible what he did to Iran. He made it a much more dangerous situation. He closed down Cuba. Cuban people are suffering greatly from this embargo that's even worse than it ever was. He wouldn't allow American citizens even to go there. He doesn't allow Cubans to send money to Cuba. Venezuela, the same kind of behavior. So I don't see where Trump there was any improvement on Bush or Obama for that matter.
Well, no, nor do I at the end of the day. But the point I was just trying to make was that I think his intention was, if he was being honest about it.
I don't think he had any intention. I don't think he thought ahead far. I just think he did it because who knows why he did it. But I don't see a reformer in him at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking at Tulsi Gabbard too. I like her very much. I think she would be wonderful. But okay, so let's keep going because we haven't actually talked about the evidence, Oliver, and I think that's important. That you have some stuff that's pretty kind of slam dunk in my view, and I thought that your chapter on the autopsy was pretty amazing. So what in kind of almost in bullet point forms, what did we learn that's new about certainly the photographs seem to have been tampered with. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, they're doctored. The official at the National Archives, the official pictures of his brain have been doctored. The brain is completely intact. It's in there, and everyone saw his brain blown out. We saw the fragments of it in Dealey Plaza. Yeah. There's the Harper fragment was found the next day. My God. The brain with the medulla, when he was brought to the to Parkland, the hospital in Dallas, almost 40 people, nurses. Audrey Bell talks about it. His brain was spilling out into the floor. It was a stream of liquid. Yeah. And when they weighed the brain for the autopsy, which was supposed to do at Bethesda, that's where the official autopsy was. Parkland was where they tried to save his life. The official autopsy later weighed his brain, and it weighed more than the average brain, which is insane because the brain was seen, was splattered and probably a half its normal size, if not more.
And the point of that is that it shows that the entrant that was an exit wound, right? That the back of the head.
That's a huge thing too. Yeah.
Yeah.
We showed 40 witnesses in our film that saw a big hole on the right side of his back of his right skull, which is where the bullet seems to have blown out. It came from the front, from the grassy knoll, and blew out his head on the back. That's always the way it is in war, anything like that. It goes in, and the greatest damage is on the other side of the body. And the nurses saw it, doctors saw it, and that became, the Warren Commission went out of its way to bury that. They put pressure on the first doctor to put the tracheotomy under his throat, Malcolm Perry. It was an interesting character. We do a little story on him in the film. And he was forced to deny. He was forced by Secret Service agent Elmer Moore to deny that there was a huge hole in the back of Kennedy's head. Deny it. And he bothered him. And we have a doctor who was a friend of his who tells us the story of one night after they'd operated on someone together, where Malcolm Perry finally told him, he said, that bullet came from the front.
Yeah.
It's a great story, but it's evident from everybody who was around him. He saw such a mess. His head was a mess. And now all of a sudden the brain is cleaned up. And the woman who processed the film in Washington, I forgot her name, she also says it's not what she saw. John Stringer, the official photographer of the autopsy, was brought back by the ARB and shown these pictures and said, I didn't shoot that. That's not even the film I used.
So they were trying to hide the fact that was an exit wound, right? Because Lee Harvey Oswald, they allege, was shooting from behind, from the Texas School Book Depository.
Yeah, everything. When the Warren Commission put itself in the straitjacket, when they said 3 bullets from the book depository, Oswald, and nothing else. There had to be more than 3 bullets. We go into that detail about how many shots there were. There had to be at least 4, maybe 6. Wow. So, and we show why. There's such a damage in that car, and the fragmentation, and Connolly's wound, and the magic bullet concept is ridiculous. It always was ridiculous, but somehow it got through the American public because nobody follows the details. I mean, the details, a lot of people did follow them and wrote about them. There's no question you can't defend this magic bullet that goes through Connolly and Kennedy. So we have more than 3 shots. There's also the story of the 6th floor. Now, we go we bring out the testimony of 3 secretaries who were there that day on the 4th floor. Dorothy Arne Garner was their supervisor, Victoria Adams and Vicki Stiles. 3 of them, the moment they saw Kennedy shot on the 4th floor, ran down those stairs. 2 of them ran down the stairs to see what happened. Garner stayed at the top of the stairs watching them. Then the 2 policemen came. The one policeman, Malcolm Baker, came up, and Roy Truly, the supervisor of those 2, they came up. They say they had seen Oswald on the 2nd floor at the lunchroom on the way up. Both of them said that. So there was no time for Oswald to come down those stairs. Those secretaries vouched for it, that they had ran right to the stairs. He was on the 6th floor. He had to dump the rifle. He had to go through all those boxes, and he had to get down those stairs. No way.
So do you think that, just to be clear, do you think that Oswald was not involved in this at all? Like, I always thought...
No, he was definitely... We go into the history of Oswald, the fingerprints of intelligence, as he worked with the CIA. He didn't know exactly what he was being used for. He wanted to be a spy, and the CIA used him as a patsy, as an asset. They sent him to Russia as part of that defective program, and there was a program to gather intelligence in the Soviet Union. Several people were involved, several GIs, ex-GIs, low level. That's always what it was, low level. And they came back into the country with ease. They came back with ease into the country, never investigated, and then used again in the South, moving around cities they didn't know where they were going to kill him, but they certainly knew he was going to go down in the fall in the South, probably. Although there was an attempt in Chicago. We go into that, the attempt in Chicago.
But Oliver, I guess what I'm saying is it your contention that he was in the school book depository and took one of the shots, or that he was not involved at all in the shooting?
No, he wasn't even on the 6th floor, is what I'm saying.
Right. Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah.
It was impossible for anybody to be on the 6th floor and not be seen coming down those stairs. There's only one set of stairs. So, and by the way, and in that regard, I'm wrong in my movie of 91. because I had people on the 6th floor. But there's no way they could have gotten out. No way at all. So I don't even think the 6th floor was activated. I think the shot from the rears came from the other building. There's 2 other suspect buildings. So I think 1 shot from the rear, maybe 2, and 2 shots from the front. Maybe another one. So that's at least 4, maybe 5, maybe 6.
How valuable was the Zapruder film in this historical event? The Zapruder film, how important has it been in the examination of these events, do you think? In other words, would we know what we know if Abraham Zapruder had not been there that day rolling film?
Well, I think the same evidence would have come out eventually because it was such a lie. But the Zapruder film certainly gives us a time on the assassination and limits what the Warren Commission can do because it's got a time frame.
Yeah.
And also, you see, by the way, in the Zapruder film, very clearly, even if it's been messed with, the film shows Kennedy going back and to the left when he's hit.
Yeah.
From the front. So
just to recap, so the film, as I viewed it, it's very granular, and I'm going to watch it again, actually, too. It does, in my view, posit a scenario that is almost, I thought the evidence was very strong. I do a lot of true crime documentaries, and if you just treat this like a true crime story, with your argument about chain of evidence, right? I mean,
chain of custody. Chain
of custody. Yeah.
None of these bullets, not even the rifle has a chain of custody on it. The rifle is not the same rifle that Oswald purchased. On the other hand, there's another deputy, Roger Craig, who saw a Mauser when he was up there, and that was never seen again. So
what's a Mauser? What's a Mauser?
A Mauser is a better rifle than the Carcano, which was a cheap Italian rifle that you couldn't even shoot rabbit with. It's just really a bad rifle.
Okay.
And Oswald was not a great shot anyway, but that's all beside the point. The point is that on everything, the bullets, the crucial bullets, and the rifles itself, there's no chain of custody. And that goes to the top. And it shows that the FBI was lying about the magic bullet because we show that conflict in times. And all this has been found out, by the way, by civilian researchers. Nobody in the goddamn government did anything except for one man, Otto Otemka, who actually tracked Oswald and as an agent, and then knew something was up, and of course was fired. Was fired before about 15 days before the assassination. There's so much here. I get, you get lost in all this stuff, but you have to stay to the basics. Chain of custody is in any trial. In any trial, you need chain of custody to prove guilt. Yeah. Oswald would have been laughed out of court on day one.
Absolutely. Like a prosecutor wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's not, there's no case. There's no case. So I want to recommend very highly that our audience views the film. I think it's really, really important, especially in light of the way we live now with a news media that is completely unreliable and in most places utterly captured by the powers that be. They take dictation, they don't examine or investigate anymore, and they're not on our side.
Well, right now, the media goes along with what the government says. The government puts out a communique. And because we remember what we had after Vietnam, we embedded all reporters with we embedded reporters with the military, correct? You can't wander around and find your own story. You can't do any investigation, basically. Yeah. So the media has been co-opted completely. So they depend on these handouts. And of course, if the government says it, then they believe it. These people are unqualified to be reporters. I saw them on TV. I can't believe some of these people. They have no they may have gone to the Columbia School of Journalism, but they really don't know what they're doing.
No, they don't. And I will say, from my perspective as somebody who was an investigative journalist on one of the biggest shows in the world and was really proud of that work, I don't even know what I'm seeing anymore. I mean, this has been really traumatic for me to watch the unfolding of the utter abdication. Not that, I mean, look, the media was not perfect, but they're not even pretending anymore to be.
Now they're covering up. And they won't go back. They won't even look at the evidence. If you bring this evidence on any television, mainstream television show, they don't allow it.
Oliver, thank you very, very much for this. I know you've got to go, and we're very, very grateful that you gave us this time today. And, keep on going. It's an important story. We need your voice. So keep on going. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Trish. And thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was Oscar-winning producer, director, screenwriter, Oliver Stone. Very, very smart chap. And you got to think about what his life is like in Hollywood, right? Because he's constantly challenging narratives that are almost universally embraced by the lefties in Hollywood. So I don't know if he's like some of the great COVID heretics and Stephen Cohen, some of the great foreign policy heretics Stephen Cohen died, unfortunately, but I think he wasn't getting invited to too many dinner parties in New York. And I don't know, it must be an interesting life for him. We didn't have time to get into any of that stuff, but how do you survive in Hollywood socially when you're constantly pissing off people by wanting to actually hear what Vladimir Putin says or telling the truth about American meddling in Ukraine as he does in Ukraine on Fire? I mean, and also, obviously this latest documentary, which I'm sure that ilk of society now just want to move away from. Everybody is so now entrenched in this kind of state-driven narrative. I mean, the lefties are, right? That he may be unpopular over this too. I don't know. I'm glad he got a distribution deal for it. You must watch it. It's very granular, meaning it's super dense. He brings the receipts, as they say. And so I actually watched it the first time with a paper and pen so I could remember everybody, who they were and what the evidence was. But it's really convincing. He makes a very, very good case. And I just want you people to really understand why that is a massive deal. It told those people that they could get away with all kinds of nasty stuff. And the nasty stuff is stuff that was absolutely subverting democracy. So let's talk about Oliver Stone's statement that he made on his Twitter after the Russian invasion. I suspect he was quite upset by that. But you know what? Smart people, serious people had been warning that this was going to happen for a very long time if Putin was not given some kind of reasonable assurances around security. He's been asking for them for a very long time, meaning don't let Ukraine join NATO. Don't let NATO enroll more countries right up on the border. I mean, that's what Putin was asking for. And in fact, as I understand it, that's what Russia was promised when the Soviet Union broke up. So no one is excusing in any way, shape, or form what Putin has done. But people like Oliver Stone and Stephen Cohen and many other, Mearsheimer at UChicago, many brilliant people have been warning about this for a long time. And it was the American State Department that dropped the ball because they've been meddling in there so long. It's almost like they goaded Russia into this, but don't get me going on that. We're going to talk about that on the live stream next week. Here's what Oliver Stone says. Although the United States has many wars of aggression on its conscience, it doesn't justify Mr. Putin's aggression in Ukraine. A dozen wrongs don't make a right. Russia was wrong to invade. It has made too many mistakes, underestimating the Ukrainian resistance, overestimating the military's ability to achieve its objective, understanding Europe's reaction, especially Germany, upping its military contribution to NATO, which they've resisted for some 20 years. Even Switzerland has joined the cause. Russia will be more isolated than ever from the West, underestimating the enhanced power of NATO, which will now put more pressure on Russia's borders, probably putting Ukraine into NATO, underestimating the damage to its own economy and certainly creating more internal resistance in Russia, creating a major readjustment of power in its oligarch class, putting cluster and vacuum bombs into play, and underestimating the power of social media worldwide. These are, in Oliver Stone's words, the mistakes that Russia made in this invasion, to name just a few. But then he says, but we must wonder, how could Putin have saved the Russian-speaking people of Donetsk and Luhansk? No doubt his government could have done a better job of showing the world the 8 years of suffering of those people and their refugees, as well as highlighting the Ukrainian buildup of 110,000 soldiers on the Donetsk-Luhansk borders, which was occurring essentially before the Russian buildup. But the West has far stronger public relations than the Russians. Or perhaps Putin should have surrendered the 2 holdout provinces and offered 1 to 3 million people help to relocate to Russia. The world might have understood better the aggression of the Ukrainian government. But then again, I'm not sure. But now it's too late. Putin has allowed himself to be baited and fallen into the trap set by the U.S. and has committed his military, empowering the worst conclusions the West can make. He probably, I think, has given up on the West, and this brings us closer than ever to a final confrontation. There seems to be no road back. The only ones happy about this are Russian nationalists and the legion of Russian haters who finally got what they've been dreaming of for years, i.e. Biden, the Pentagon, the CIA, the EU, NATO, mainstream media, and don't overlook Nuland and her sinister neocon gang in D.C. That's Victoria Nuland, who we've talked about on the show. This will significantly vindicate the uber hawks in public eyes, pointing out the toxicity of their policies. Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, NATO expansion, breaking nuclear treaties, censoring and omitting crucial facts from the news will be next to impossible. Pointing out Western double standards, including Zelensky's bad behavior, will likewise fall on deaf ears as we draw the wrong conclusions. It's easier now to smear those of us who tried to understand the Russian position through these last 2 decades. We tried. But now is the time, as JFK and Khrushchev faced down the perilous situation in Cuba in October 1962, for the 2 nuclear powers to walk this back from the abyss. Both sides need to save face. This isn't a moment for the U.S. to gloat. As a Vietnam War veteran and as a man who's witnessed the endless antagonism of the Cold War, demonizing and humiliating foreign leaders is not a policy that can succeed. It only makes the situation worse. Back-channel negotiations are necessary because whatever happens in the next few days or weeks, the specter of a final war must be realistically accepted and brokered. Who can do that? Are there real statesmen among us? The great unseen tragedy at the heart of this history of our times is the loss of a true peaceful partnership between Russia and the U.S., with, yes, potentially China. No reason why not accept America's desire for dominance. The idiots who kept provoking Russia after the Cold War ended in 1991 have committed a terrible crime against humanity and the future. Together, our countries could have been natural allies in the biggest battle of all against climate change. In its technical achievements alone, in large-scale science, in its rocketry, heavy industries, and its most modern, clean nuclear energy reactors, Russia has been a great friend to man. Alas, in our century so far, man has failed to see or reach for the stars. I would say I agree with very, very much of that, actually. I don't think it should be controversial, but it will be. And I want to leave you with something to think about. And it's what Oliver Stone was getting at in those words, and what I've been getting at for a few weeks now about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has nukes. We have to take that seriously. One of the NGOs in Washington who investigates the possibility of nuclear war breaking out has raised the possibility to 40% over what's going on. And yet the yahoos, and I'm going to use that word, in Washington and in other governments around the world are cheering this on as if it's some kind of a digital war game and that there can be a good outcome through violence. There can't be. There will not be. Oliver Stone is right. They must speak. And as I understand it, at some point recently, Zelensky said NATO could be taken off the table. So I know we're being lied to. The lies are getting bigger and more brazen. And it seems the more bigger and brazen they get, the more people are likely to absolutely accept them without question. So this is why a guy like Oliver Stone is important right now. It's why we must think about what happened to President Kennedy. And I'm going to leave you with a video I found. I'm going to put this out to my supporters in its entirety this week so you can watch it. It's really something. An artifact of the nuclear arms race from 1951 called Duck and Cover, put out by the Civil Defense Department for children so that they could learn how to survive a nuclear attack by hiding under their desks. Imagine that. Like, they don't say what to do after well, you'd be dead, but they don't say even if you survived what you would do, because you would die anyway over time, as people did at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's a ludicrous cartoon, and it is hosted by a cartoon turtle, and it's called Duck and Cover. Stay critical. See ya.
Dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
and you
and you
and you, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and Cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association. Produced by Archer Productions, Incorporated. Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time. Fire is a danger. It can burn whole buildings if someone is careless. But we are ready for fires. We have a fine fire department to put out the fire, and you have fire drills in your school so you know what to do. Automobiles can be dangerous, too. They sometimes cause bad accidents, but we are ready. We have safety rules that car drivers and people who are walking must obey. Now, we must be ready for a new danger, the atomic bomb. First, you have to know what happens when an atomic bomb explodes. You will know when it comes. We hope it never comes, but we must get ready. It looks something like this. There is a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. If you are not ready and did not know what to do, it could hurt you in different ways. It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town. But if you duck and cover like Bert, you will be much safer. You know how bad sunburn can feel. The atomic bomb flash could burn you worse than a terrible sunburn, especially where you're not covered. Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face. Duck and cover underneath a table or desk or anything else close by. In Betty's school, they are talking about the atomic bomb, too. Betty is asking her teacher, how can we tell when the atomic bomb may explode? And her teacher is explaining that there are two kinds of attack, with warning and without any warning. We think that most of the time we will be warned before the bomb explodes, so there will be time for us to get into our homes, schools, or some other safe place. Our civil defense workers and our men in uniform will do everything they can to warn us before enemy planes can bring a bomb near us. You may be in your schoolyard playing when the signal comes. That signal means to stop whatever you are doing and get to the nearest safe place fast. Always remember, a flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time, no matter where you may be.